Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Adelman. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe, and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. Let's get to it. When Leonid Brezhnev took the reins of power in the Soviet Union in 1964, his nation was reeling from decades of economic upheavals, famines, government-sponsored terror campaigns, and the worst war in the history of the world. In stark contrast to the revolutionary ambitions of his predecessors, Brezhnev had far more down-to-earth goals for the future of the USSR, stability and economic prosperity for all Soviet citizens. Brezhnev is credited for bringing stability to a country that desperately needed it, and also criticized for allowing that stability to decay into stagnation in the second half of his rule, undoing many of his achievements in the process. Historians argue that the Soviet Union matured into a true superpower under his watch, but also that he oversaw the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet system he'd served faithfully for his entire life. Indeed, less than a decade after his death, the Union itself died, along with all the communist governments in Eastern Europe it oversaw. Brezhnev was a complicated man, undoubtedly a product and a supporter of the communist system. He stood out from other Soviet leaders by acting more like a Western politician than a Soviet dictator. Once one of the most charismatic and polished world leaders of his day, much of his final years were spent in a desperate attempt to conceal his descent into illness and addiction from the public. This secrecy has caused a number of myths and misconceptions about Brezhnev and his contemporaries that have only recently been corrected thanks to the opening of old Soviet archives. Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was born on December 19, 1906, in the Ukrainian town of Kamensko, today Kamyanske. Kamensko, known in the Soviet era as Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, was a factory town. Most residents, including Brezhnev's father, were employed by the large ironworks owned by the South Russia Company. Initially, Brezhnev wasn't an enthusiastic communist. Not only was he still a boy when Lenin's October Revolution began in 1917, but during the ensuing civil war, he and his family were nearly killed on multiple occasions when the city was sacked by both red and white factions. He was lucky to survive the conflict, which killed 10 million people, mostly civilians, but had no way of knowing that this was only the first of a generation's worth of cataclysms that would put his life in jeopardy. In his youth, Brezhnev had dreams of being an actor. Unfortunately for him, arts and culture were not highly valued in the newly created Soviet Union. They were dismissed as unnecessary decadence for the ruling class. Instead, he studied land management and agriculture at a technical college in the nearby city of Kursk. When he joined the Communist Party in 1929, he likely did so because by this point, advancement in the country was only possible for party members. It was not an easy time to work in land management. The country was now ruled by Joseph Stalin, who had decided to reorganize all agricultural land in the Soviet Union into a series of large state-owned collective farms. Farmers who owned their own land, called kulaks, were labeled as enemies of the people by the government. They were forcibly deprived of their property, and many of them were either killed outright or deported to labor camps, the infamous gulags. The agricultural upheaval caused by collectivization led to widespread famines in the early 1930s, leading to the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens from malnutrition. Evidently, Brezhnev grew weary of this work after a few years, returning to his hometown and enrolling in another technical school, the Arsenichev Institute of Metallurgy, graduating as an engineer in 1935. Rapid industrialization of the country was the other major part of Stalin's economic agenda, so a man who had experience with both engineering and agriculture proved to have the perfect combination of skills to advance rapidly as the party functionary and apparatchik. If you've ever traveled out of the country like so many who wanted to flee the USSR in the 80s, then you know how much of a hassle it is to find signal with your regular cell phone provider, and not to mention the extreme roaming charges. And that's why we've partnered with today's sponsor, Saley, because they offer this product called an eSIM card. What's an eSIM? Well, it's a digital version of the SIM cards that go into smartphones. But Saley's eSIMs are able to give you network coverage and data even while you're abroad visiting Canada for no real reason whatsoever. Best of all, once the eSIM is installed, there's no need to install a new eSIM for each country. And Saley's plans are extremely affordable, are available in over 190 countries, and you won't ever have to deal with roaming charges again. So what are you waiting for? Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saley data plans when you use code BIOS at checkout. Download the Saley app or go to saley.com/BIOS. One of the reasons for Brezhnev's rapid advancement in the late 1930s was the dramatic number of vacancies that opened up ahead of him. This was the period of the Great Terror, when Stalin moved to consolidate his power over the country by eliminating his rivals. His paranoia saw enemies and counter-revolutionaries everywhere and dispatched his secret police, the NKVD, to arrest and torture anyone he suspected of plotting against him. Over 700,000 people were executed during the Purge, and millions more were sent to the Gulag. During this time period, failure to fulfill the plans and directives of the government in Moscow was simply unacceptable. It didn't matter how unrealistic the plans were, or if the regional governments received enough resources to fulfill them. Party cadres were expected to deliver results. If they didn't, they not only ran the risk of getting fired, but of getting denounced as a traitor and shot. Brezhnev was able to survive in this hostile environment by pushing himself to the very breaking point, working himself to exhaustion, and exhorting those under him to do the same. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Brezhnev found himself in uniform along with most of the rest of the country. As one of the Red Army's political commissars, he was responsible for the morale of the troops, ensuring they fought with a proper communist zeal on behalf of the nation. This could be a potentially dangerous job. The Germans executed any captured commissars that fell into their hands immediately. Beyond serving as a morale officer, Brezhnev proved useful to his superiors by showcasing an ability to scrounge for much-needed supplies for the army, including food and clothing. The chief political commissar was one of Stalin's closest allies, Nikita Khrushchev. Brezhnev had first come to the attention of Khrushchev in the 1930s, when the latter was the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, while Brezhnev was an up-and-coming party official. They would meet again during the war, when Khrushchev took the younger man under his wing. At the time, one of the way party apparatchiks protected themselves from the NKVD's purges was to form networks of friends and colleagues that would work to protect each other from political opponents who might denounce them in an effort to have them killed. Having a made man like Khrushchev at the head of your network provided even more protection. And Brezhnev would serve Khrushchev faithfully as one of his closest protégés for 2 decades. After the war, Brezhnev's career began to take off thanks to the influence of his patron Khrushchev. He would serve as the Union's head man in both the recently annexed Moldavia, today Moldova, and in Kazakhstan. During his time, Stalin died, and Khrushchev successfully outmaneuvered his rivals to become the new leader of the Soviet Union. He began to replace members of the party Presidium, the central governing apparatus of the country, with his own people, which brought Brezhnev to Moscow in 1956, where he became Khrushchev's right-hand man. As a party secretary, Brezhnev oversaw the defense industry, which had been ramping up significantly in the post-war years as part of a growing rivalry with the United States and her allies, as well as the new space program, which achieved several milestones, including launching the first satellite into orbit and sending the first man and later first woman into space. In 1960, he was made president of the Soviet Union, making him nominally the head of state, although actual power remained with Khrushchev. Brezhnev nevertheless enjoyed his new role, which brought him to the attention of the rest of the world for the first time as he undertook diplomatic missions on behalf of the country. For decades, it was believed that the reason Khrushchev was ousted from his position as general secretary was that his reforms instituted in the aftermath of Stalin's death had gone too far for his colleagues in the Presidium, and that the old hardliners had been responsible for getting rid of him. The truth was somewhat more personal. By 1964, Khrushchev had alienated almost everyone around him with his attitude. He assumed more and more a dictatorial style, making unilateral decisions without consulting his colleagues. He took steps to humiliate anyone who disagreed with him about anything, and had no compunction about utterly destroying the careers and reputations of rivals who challenged him. In the end, he even turned on loyal allies like Brezhnev, mocking him openly as a sycophant. In October, the rest of the leadership had finally had enough of Khrushchev. In a bloodless coup largely organized by Brezhnev, Khrushchev was denounced and put out to pasture, forced to retire to his dacha on the outskirts of Moscow, where he died in 1971. Brezhnev took over as general secretary, and one of his first acts was to restrain some of his more bloodthirsty colleagues who wanted Khrushchev put on trial and humiliated in revenge for what he'd done to them. But that wasn't Brezhnev's style. For years, he had built a reputation as a nice guy, someone who worked well with colleagues and went out of his way to avoid alienating and humiliating anyone, even his opponents. In subsequent clashes over the following decades, the pattern would repeat. Rivals he'd successfully outmaneuvered out of their positions would be allowed to retain their dignity and to comfortably retire with grace, something that would have been unheard of in Stalin's day. After decades of war, famine, and state-sponsored violence and chaos, Brezhnev sought to bring stability to the Soviet Union for the first time since its founding. He ended the game of musical chairs that political appointments had become, ensuring that regional cadres weren't replaced after a single bad harvest or other mistake. He restored the old name of the party presidium, the Politburo, and also restored its policy of collective leadership, that is, making decisions as a group instead of being dictated by one man. Brezhnev excelled at consensus building and did not shy away from differing opinions. This was just one of many ways in which Brezhnev differed from his predecessors. His hobbies, which included hunting, driving fast cars, and womanizing, were not generally considered appropriate for a Soviet man of the people, drawing negative connotations with the Western politicians that they so despised. Brezhnev believed that the only way to obtain a truly communist society was to raise the standard of living among all Soviet citizens to the point they would want for nothing. In accordance with this, his economic plans dictated that Soviet industry start to produce consumer goods in greater numbers, including cars. He also sought to rectify the housing shortage by constructing apartment blocks across the country. His message that every Soviet family deserved to own an apartment and a car was a welcome relief from the dramatic ideological shifts of previous decades. By the mid-1970s, however, it seemed like the modest economic growth experienced in the early years of Brezhnev's reign were disappearing, replaced by stagnation. There were several reasons for this, foremost among them being excessive military spending and a failure to resolve the persistent problem of agriculture. It seemed that no matter what Soviet leadership tried, they were unable to produce enough food to feed their people, and were forced to buy grain and foodstuffs from the West in exchange for raw materials, especially oil and gas. It's almost as if international trade is good for your economy or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. The problem was, after decades enmeshed in the Soviet system, Brezhnev had become a true believer. The system itself was perfect and above reproach. Because you couldn't reform the economic system in any way, that meant that the only thing you could do was try to convince the farm laborers and regional leadership figures to work harder to meet Moscow's quotas. This was a gentler version of the same type of coercion that dated all the way back to the 1930s. Brezhnev seemed not to understand that just because he had ruined his health and worked himself nearly to death to meet Stalin's demands didn't mean that other younger apparatchiks were willing to do the same, especially now that the threat of death and disgrace no longer hung over them. Brezhnev's policy of stability and building networks of supporters also worked against him by preventing him from replacing ineffective or corrupt cadres, or of replacing older party figures with younger protégés as the next generation came into their own. The last years of Brezhnev's reign have been described as a gerontocracy, a country ruled by men significantly older than the rest of the population and who were considered out of touch with the modern world and the needs of Soviet citizens. Hey, we've got one of those right now. Another problem that plagued the economy was the fact that Brezhnev had to fight for power almost from the moment he replaced Khrushchev. Unlike his predecessors who had moved to liquidate rivals as soon as possible, Brezhnev spent decades slowly consolidating his position. A slow-moving chess game that ensured he wasn't viewed as an autocrat, but also meant that differing visions for the economic future of the country were being pursued in different sectors of the economy. The end result was shortages of everything, including the consumer goods Brezhnev insisted every Soviet man and woman should have. The waiting list for cars, for instance, was always long, and the store shelves in small towns and even large cities stood empty. When it came to foreign policy, Brezhnev sought to back away from the hardline approach of Khrushchev, which had led to the brink of catastrophe during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. During a period known as the détente lasting from the 60s to the early 70s, Brezhnev sought to thaw the Cold War somewhat by coming to terms with Western leaders, particularly West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, French President Georges Pompidou, and US President Richard Nixon. Brezhnev had similar temperament and interest to these men, and sought to build a personal relationship with them that would lead to greater trust and understanding on not only a human level, but a diplomatic one as well. For a while, it seemed like the threat of nuclear war between the two superpowers was over, or at least greatly reduced, as negotiations between Brezhnev and Nixon led to the signing of Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, and Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABMT, in 1972. A further arms reduction treaty, SALT II, was discussed at length, and it seemed likely to happen until all of Brezhnev's diplomatic partners disappeared suddenly, almost all at once. Brandt and Nixon were forced to resign because of scandals, while Pompidou died in office. At the same time, Brezhnev's own health began to decline, and his duties began to be taken over by more hardline colleagues. The level of understanding that had existed between Eastern and Western leaders was replaced by increased suspicion, secrecy, and brinkmanship. All of this culminated in what is considered the worst foreign policy decision in the entire history of the Soviet Union: the invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. The Soviets had long enjoyed close relations with the Afghan government, relations that were threatened by the near-total collapse of the country following a communist-inspired takeover of the Afghan government in 1978 that led to civil war. Brezhnev himself had set a precedent a decade earlier following the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, announcing at a party meeting that any threats against socialist brother countries would be met with military force. It was known in the West as the Brezhnev Doctrine. As they watched the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan throughout 1979, many within the Politburo felt they had no choice but to send the troops in to stabilize the country. The Soviet leadership believed that it was possible to replace the unstable Afghan government with one more aligned to their interests and leave following a short military intervention. Instead, the Red Army had kicked a hornet's nest, as it seemed like the entire country rose up to oppose their occupation. Guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen occupied the hills and countryside, launching raids against Soviet troops, which were confined to the major cities. Meanwhile, the invasion was met with almost universal condemnation by the rest of the world, with the US leading a 60-nation boycott of the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow, as well as other economic sanctions. Neutral observers considered it ironic that after years of criticizing the United States for its intervention in Vietnam, the USSR had found itself in an almost identical situation a decade later. As Brezhnev grew older, his health began to fail him. Much of this decline can be traced to a growing dependence on a potent cocktail of sleeping pills and other sedatives, compounded by taking them together with alcohol. He made several attempts to get clean, including a stint in a rehab hospital, but always relapsed. His addiction gradually made him all but unable to work, as he was prone to falling asleep during meetings or even important functions like diplomatic conferences. His inability to be awakened on time led him to be late to several meetings with other world leaders, considered a major diplomatic faux pas. Nevertheless, he could not be permitted to retire, and he probably should have as early as 1975, because there was no structure in place to permit the leader of the Soviet Union to retire. All of his predecessors had either died in office or been forced out, and the entire power structure was predicated on him being at the top of the pyramid. His colleagues at the Politburo worried the entire thing would collapse without him acting as a figurehead, so he was persuaded to keep on despite growing more and more feeble every year. So most of the day-to-day responsibility for running the country was quietly passed on to others, and his addiction to pills was a closely guarded state secret, his frequent absences dismissed as being the result of other minor health issues. Meanwhile, a cult of personality was allowed to grow around Brezhnev that he likely would not have allowed had he been in his right mind. After all, he had rallied against similar cults being established around Stalin and Khrushchev in the past. Brezhnev cut an increasingly pathetic figure in his last years, as his colleagues sought to keep him happy by finding more and more medals and titles to award him with, preying on his fondness for elaborate ceremony and military decorations. Regular Soviet citizens began to mock Brezhnev and the Soviet power structure he represented, especially as the growing gap between the idealistic propaganda and the grim economic realities became more and more apparent. Brezhnev died in his sleep on November 10, 1982, at the age of 75. His state funeral was as elaborate as possible, which is ironic considering that in many ways it also served as the funeral of the Soviet Union itself. Throughout the 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet system became wider and wider. The country's attempt to compete militarily with the US was out of all proportion of the revenues coming in, and economic stagnation descended into outright crisis. The war in Afghanistan was like an open wound that refused to close. The Soviets finally withdrew their troops in 1989 after the deaths of 15,000 Red Army soldiers and as many as 2 million Afghanis. By that point, the entire system was on the brink of collapse. New Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who took power in 1985, initiated many reforms, including moving away from the official policy of ignoring or hiding bad news. But all that did was highlight how bad the average Soviet citizen had it compared to their Western counterparts. One by one, all of the USSR's Warsaw Pact allies collapsed, their communist governments sacked, and on December 31, 1991, less than 10 years after Brezhnev's death, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist, being broken up into 15 separate nation-states. In the years after his death, many blamed Brezhnev for the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly politicians like Gorbachev, who crowned the Brezhnev period the era of stagnation. But if that's true, he's hardly the only one to blame. After all, Brezhnev was a product of the Soviet system. He lived almost his entire life and the entirety of his professional career under it. Lessons in survival he learned in the early days under Stalin were lessons he and his peers carried for the rest of their lives. And they guided the nation under those ideals because that's all they knew. The truth is, Leonid Brezhnev was a product of his time, for better or worse. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a historical figure we should cover next, subscribe and ring that bell, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.